In a house on a quiet Westheimer Street in Houston, everything looked like it was getting ready for a celebration. On the table was a cake with a brightly colored inscription, 10 years together. And all over the house were photos of happy moments. From the beaches of Mexico, romantic trips to Paris and family parties. Spouses Ryan and Laura Brooks seemed to be celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary, and no one could have predicted that the day would end in tragedy. Laura, a 35-year-old woman with expressive eyes and a warm smile, was a junior high school teacher at a local school. Ryan, 2 years older, worked as an engineer for a major oil company. Their life seemed quite ordinary and successful. A good job, a cozy house, a couple of dogs. But the outward well-being hid the tension and reticence that had been eating away at their relationship for the past few years. That evening, Laura decided to have a dinner in honor of their anniversary. She cooked herself, Ryan's favorite grilled meats, pasta with vegetables, and homemade lemonade. She decorated the table with flowers, lit candles, and waited for her husband, who was supposed to come home from work around 7 in the evening. But Ryan was late, and her joyful mood was gradually replaced by anxiety. Time dragged on, the hands of the clock showing 8:30 p.m., when Ryan finally crossed the threshold of the house. Ryan entered the house, his face serious and pensive. He noticed the birthday table, cake, and flowers, but he didn't say a word. Laura sensed something was wrong, but didn't ask questions right away. Ryan sat down at the table, reached for a glass of wine, but immediately got up and went into the living room, leaving his wife alone. It was already about 9 p.m. on the clock when Laura texted Ryan, "Are you okay? Can we talk?" He didn't respond, so she decided to go upstairs to their bedroom, where she saw him sitting on the bed. He was holding a box of their wedding photos and looked strangely detached. Ryan suddenly said, "You know, we both deserve to be happy, but I guess we're both miserable." Those words were unexpected to Laura. She tried to understand what had happened and offered to discuss their relationship calmly. But Ryan was already on the verge of a breakdown. He started talking about how their time together had changed, how sincere conversations and shared dreams had disappeared. He accused Laura of becoming cold and distant, and of caring more about her work and friends than about him. The argument turned into a fight when Laura said they needed to have a serious talk about the future. She suggested they take a break and live apart for a while to sort out their feelings. It was as if those words had set off some kind of trigger in Ryan. His face contorted with anger, and he shouted at her, accusing her of betrayal and selfishness. Laura was shocked by this outburst of emotion. She had never seen her husband like this. After a few minutes of yelling and mutual accusations, Ryan suddenly fell silent. He turned and walked out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut. Laura was left standing there at a loss. She found it hard to believe that their wedding anniversary would end like this. She set off after him, but no sooner had she reached the stairs than she heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It was the sound of a knife drawer being opened. Laura went downstairs and saw Ryan with a kitchen knife in his hands. He was standing there, breathing heavily, his eyes clouded as if he didn't realize what he was doing. She tried to approach him, to calm him down, but he suddenly took a sharp step toward her and swung the knife. Laura recoiled, shrieking, and ran for the exit. But Ryan seemed to lose control. He caught up with her in the living room and struck the first blow. Laura fell to the floor, hitting her head on the coffee table. Her blood spread quickly across the carpet, but she was still alive and trying to crawl away. Ryan, standing over her, seemed to regain his senses for a moment, but then raised the knife again. The second blow struck her in the chest, and then the third in the stomach. Laura stopped struggling, her breathing quieted, and her eyes remained open, filled with horror and incomprehension. Ryan stood over his wife's body, holding the bloody knife, and seemed to slowly begin to realize what had just happened. He threw the knife to the floor, sat down next to the body, and covered his face with his hands. It was like a moment of utter despair and powerlessness. He sat like that for a few minutes, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. Then he got up, pulled out his cell phone, and dialed 911. 15 minutes later, the police arrived on the scene. Ryan came out to them with his hands up, completely covered in blood, and said he had killed his wife. The house was surrounded by police cars and ambulances. Laura was already dead, and the paramedics only pronounced her dead. The police immediately arrested Ryan without asking for motives or details. He was brought to the station, where he immediately confessed to the murder. When asked about the reasons for his actions, he replied that he did not remember the details, but felt as if he was in some kind of trance, not realizing his actions. His eyes were empty, and there was no expression on his face. Investigators proceeded to examine the crime scene. The house was plunged into an eerie silence, the photographs and jewelry Laura had prepared contrasting with the bloody scene in the living room. Forensics caught everything on camera and took blood and fingerprint samples. The knife used by Ryan was placed in a plastic evidence bag. News of the tragedy spread quickly throughout Houston. Neighbors and friends of the Brooks family were shocked to learn of the incident. Many of them had last seen the couple just a couple days ago. They looked quite happy. No one could have guessed that behind the facade of prosperity lurked such a deep crack. A few days later, a forensic examination began, which was to confirm the cause of Laura's death. At the same time, investigators began to study the history of the Brooks family to understand what could have pushed Ryan to such an act. They interviewed relatives, friends, and colleagues of the couple, trying to restore the picture of their relationship. It emerged that over the past few months, Ryan had often complained of depression and problems at work. He told friends that he felt tired and emotionally drained. Laura also told her friend that times were tough in their relationship and she was thinking about living apart for a while. But no one around them expected that it would lead to such a tragedy. The court hearings promised to be long and tense. The prosecution was going to prove that the murder was premeditated and carefully planned, while the defense argued that Ryan was in a state of temporary psychosis and was not aware of his actions. There were many questions to be answered. The story of the Brooks family, seemingly perfect on the outside, turned out to be tragic on the inside. An anniversary that was supposed to be a symbol of love and fidelity turned into a day when one spouse's life ended and the other's was destroyed. Houston investigators began investigating the murder of Laura Brooks immediately after the arrest of her husband Ryan. Despite his confession, police officers understood that the case required an in-depth investigation to establish true motives and rule out all possible leads, including self-defense, accident, or outside interference. Given that the incident occurred on their wedding anniversary, the case immediately gained public attention. However, the details of their relationship and hidden issues remained a mystery. Houston Police Captain Carl Rivera took charge of the case. On the first day, he sent a team of investigators to the Brooks home to re-examine the crime scene. Although all the major evidence had been collected immediately after the murder, the experienced captain knew that details could have escaped attention at that point. The living room where the attack took place had been documented in numerous photographs. Traces of blood and the location of the attack provided an initial picture of the events, but it was not enough to understand the backstory of the tragedy. Investigators turned their attention to the cell phones of both spouses. In modern investigations, cell phone devices are often key sources of information, revealing details of correspondence and calls. On Laura's phone were several unread messages sent by Ryan earlier that day. In one of them, he wrote that he was running late for work and asked her not to wait for dinner. It could have been a routine message, but his strange behavior upon arriving home and the fact that he arrived around 8:30 p.m., even though he was usually back by 6, made investigators wonder. Ryan, on the other hand, was in shock immediately after the murder and could not explain his actions, he said. His phone showed no signs of planning the crime, but some calls and texts sent in the days before the tragedy caught the attention of police. In the 3 days before the murder, Ryan contacted an unknown number several times. The outgoing and incoming calls were short, but that made investigators suspicious. They decided to trace the contact. It turned out that the number Ryan frequently contacted belonged to a woman named Hannah Miller, who worked at a local cafe. Investigators learned that Ryan had been there quite often over the past few months and apparently knew Hannah as more than just an employee of the establishment. This discovery was important because a new theory was emerging. Perhaps the motive for the murder was infidelity or a love triangle. The investigators invited Hannah in for questioning. She did not deny that she knew Ryan and confirmed that they had several meetings. However, the woman insisted that they were just friends. She claimed that Ryan often complained to her about problems in his marriage and told her about his frequent fights with Laura. Investigators didn't believe such an innocuous explanation. They began to follow Hannah more closely and requested her cell phone data to verify her story. Meanwhile, the financial issues of the Brooks couple came to the attention of the investigators. A review of their bank accounts revealed that over the past 6 months, Ryan had made large transfers and spending that had not been coordinated with Laura. Several payments were made to expensive restaurants, hotels, and for gifts. The bank statements did not show exactly what the funds were spent on, but this only reinforced suspicions that Ryan may have had a mistress. In addition, investigators discovered that Laura had withdrawn a large sum from her account a month before the murder and opened a separate account. This could indicate that she was planning to separate from her husband and was preparing for a divorce, which could also have been a motive for the murder. Investigators began interviewing Laura's friends and co-workers to corroborate this theory. One of her close friends confirmed that Laura had told him of her intentions to separate from Ryan and asked for help in finding an apartment. One of the key points in the investigation had to do with the surveillance cameras installed around the perimeter of the house and on neighboring streets. A review of the footage revealed that on the day of the murder, an unidentified car was parked outside the Brooks home at around 7 p.m. The car parked at a neighboring house and was there for about 30 minutes. The owner of the car did not come out, but at some point a man who looked like Ryan came out and got into the car for a few minutes before returning to the house. Investigators identified the owner of the vehicle. It turned out to be Jake Thompson, an old friend of Ryan's from college. Jake was surprised when he was called in for questioning, but did not deny that he had seen Ryan that day. He said that they had discussed Ryan's personal problems and that Ryan had seemed very depressed. However, Jake was unable or unwilling to explain why they met specifically in front of the house and what exactly was discussed in the car. This meeting added even more questions to Ryan's version of events. Ryan may have been discussing his intentions with a friend or seeking support for his decisions. Investigators decided to check Jake's alibi for the time of the murder and his possible involvement in the crime. Further interviews with Laura's co-workers and friends confirmed that she was seriously considering divorce. Colleagues at the school said she had been visibly depressed in recent months and often mentioned the difficulties in her marriage. Some said Laura was even planning to contact a divorce lawyer. This further heightened suspicions that the murder may have been linked to her intention to end the relationship and start a new life. Ryan's friends described him as reserved and private. They saw no overt signs of aggression, but said he rarely shared his personal problems and seemed to be going through difficulties at work. One of his co-workers noted that Ryan had often stayed in the office late the past few months, working late into the night. This seemed odd considering the company wasn't going through an overload at the time. Investigators decided to check Ryan's work schedule and requested records of his time in and out of the office. It turned out that on several occasions he had left the office in the middle of the day, but it was not reflected in his schedule. This discrepancy raised even more suspicion and led police to suspect that he may have been preparing the murder in advance or meeting with someone outside of work. When investigators searched the Brooks home again, they discovered a hidden hiding place in the garage that they had not previously known about. Inside was a small bag with items including gloves, a change of clothes, and a pair of shoes. It was all carefully packed and prepared as if for a quick evacuation. One got the feeling that Ryan might have been planning an escape, but for some reason decided to stay at the scene and call the police. In addition, Laura's laptop was found in the bedroom, which had not previously been checked. Investigators discovered that in the days before the murder, she had searched for information about divorce and attorneys in Houston. Her browser also opened pages describing psychological help and support centers for women suffering from domestic violence. This discovery cast a new light on their relationship and reinforced the theory that Laura had been trying to find a way out of the situation but had fallen short. Despite Hannah Miller's initial statements, investigators began to notice some inconsistencies in her story. They invited her for a second interview, during which it became clear that she had not fully disclosed her relationship with Ryan. It turned out that they had been dating for over 6 months and had discussed the possibility of living together. Hannah claimed that she knew nothing about Ryan's plans to kill his wife and believed that he just wanted a divorce. The investigation into the murder of Laura Brooks continued, and every day new details were revealed that made it clear that their marriage was far from perfect. A seemingly simple case of domestic violence was slowly turning into a convoluted story with multiple participants, ulterior motives, and hidden threats. Houston detectives were piecing together the pieces of information in an effort to find the answer to the ultimate question. What exactly drove Ryan to murder on his wedding anniversary? After further questioning of Hannah Miller, investigators noticed her behavior and sudden nervousness. They decided to run a check of her phone and laptop. Among deleted messages and photos, they found a chain of correspondence with Ryan where they discussed the future and plans for their life together. In one of the messages, sent 2 weeks before the murder, Ryan wrote that his life was about to change forever. These messages were serious evidence that he was planning something drastic, not just a divorce. Immediately after discovering these reports, investigators requested Hannah's bank statements. They discovered that in the week before the murder, money had been deposited into her account. $15,000, transferred from an offshore account that was not directly registered to Ryan. This raised suspicions that the money may have been transferred as part of a plan to hide after the murder or to pay for facilitation. Financial forensics showed that the offshore account belonged to a company registered in Panama, but the ultimate owner was not identified. Meanwhile, investigators began looking for more witnesses from Ryan and Laura's neighborhood. They met with the couple's neighbors, who appeared to be casual witnesses to frequent arguments at the Brooks home. According to neighbor Karen Gonzalez, who lived across the street, she had repeatedly heard yelling and fighting, especially in the last 2 months. On the night of the murder, Karen saw a black car pull up to the house around 8 p.m., but she didn't pay much attention. When investigators showed her pictures of Jake Thompson's car, she identified it as the same car. This was further proof that Jake might have been involved in the murder or at least knew about Ryan's plans. In addition, Karen mentioned that a week before the tragedy, she had seen Laura out for a walk with an unknown man. This statement piqued the investigators' interest because no one had previously mentioned that Laura might have been seeing someone else. They decided to find out who this man was and what role he may have played in their lives. The repeated search of the Brooks home continued. This time, the investigators decided to pay attention to the attic and basement. In the basement, they found a small safe that had been overlooked earlier. Inside were documents, life insurance policies for Laura and Ryan, as well as their joint prenuptial agreement. It turned out that in March 2016, 3 months before the murder, Ryan had changed the terms of the insurance policy, making himself the sole beneficiary. The amount of the insurance was in excess of $500,000. This fact was a significant motive for the murder. If Laura had filed for divorce, Ryan would have lost access to that money. This revelation explained why he was unwilling to simply divorce and let her walk away. The money was the catalyst that drove him to take drastic action. Investigators began to consider this version as the main theory, but the question remained. Was Jake Thompson involved in the plan, or was he just a bystander? The investigators decided to conduct a polygraph interview with Jake Thompson. During the interrogation, Jake was nervous and confused, especially when asked about his meeting with Ryan on the day of the murder. He claimed that they had discussed work matters and did not touch the subject of Laura. But the polygraph results showed he was lying. Jake was more deeply involved in the case than investigators initially realized. At the same time, forensic investigators continued to examine the evidence from the Brooks house. They found traces of an unknown substance on knives from the kitchen that had been washed, but not thoroughly enough. This substance turned out to be tranquilizer residue, which raised questions for the investigators. If Laura was killed by the stabbing, why were the tranquilizers needed? Ryan may have been trying to sedate or immobilize her before the attack, which meant a premeditated crime. As detectives looked into the final weeks of Laura's life, they noticed her online activity. On her laptop's search engine, they found queries related to finding divorce attorneys and questions about domestic violence defense. In a recent forum Laura visited, she wrote that she was afraid of her husband and was looking for support. She mentioned that he was becoming increasingly aggressive and had started threatening her. This was strong evidence in favor of the fact that she really wanted to leave Ryan. but he wouldn't give her the opportunity. Meanwhile, detectives identified the unknown man seen with Laura on the walk. He turned out to be Thomas Ridley, a longtime friend of Laura's from her college days. He lived in Dallas but traveled to Houston for work. Thomas claimed that they had just met to talk and nothing romantic had happened between them. However, this raised suspicions with Ryan, who might have thought that Laura had a new man, and this served as another reason for his fury. The investigators decided to combine all the available data: witnesses, call records, financial documents, and evidence from the crime scene. It turns out that the day before the murder, Ryan and Jake spent a few hours at a bar. Surveillance cameras captured their animated conversation. They later went outside and talked for about 20 minutes, which caught the attention of investigators. After that, they separated in different directions. Investigators speculated that this was the last meeting where they discussed the final details of the murder. They decided to put pressure on Jake by offering him a deal in exchange for a full confession. Under threat of criminal prosecution, he began to testify. Jake admitted that Ryan had asked him to help organize the murder. He claimed that he was not directly involved in the crime itself, but knew of the plan and helped Ryan hide some of the evidence. Investigators determined that Jake and Ryan had been planning the murder for months. They made elaborate preparations to make it look like an accident or self-defense. In particular, Ryan purchased tranquilizers that he intended to put in Laura's food to make her defenseless against an attack. However, something went wrong, and everything turned out to be a bloody scene in the living room. After Jake's confession, investigators decided to arrest him for accessory to murder. He tried to negotiate a reduced sentence, but the investigation considered his role too significant. Ryan, on the other hand, was charged with first-degree premeditated murder motivated by financial gain and jealousy. The investigation began preparing the case for trial, gathering all the evidence, witness testimony, and financial documents. Meanwhile, rumors about the case began to spread in Houston, and the press actively covered every step of the investigation. Residents of the city discussed how a seemingly happy couple was involved in such a gruesome crime. Laura was the victim of a marriage that had broken down because of greed, jealousy, and betrayal. The investigation was confident that they had managed to gather enough evidence to charge Ryan and Jake, but they realized that this was only the beginning. A long and complicated trial lay ahead, where defense attorneys could try to refute the prosecution's version of events by presenting them in a different light. Despite significant evidence and a co-conspirator's confession, the investigators knew they would have to justify every conclusion gathered during the investigation. As the trial approached, the investigative team prepared to present all the evidence in front of the jury that would decide the fate of the defendants. Ryan, who seemed like an ordinary husband and good citizen, had become a symbol of betrayal and ruthlessness, ready to take the life of the man with whom he had shared years for the sake of money and new relationships. The trial promised to be high-profile and the outcome unpredictable. In August 2017, a trial began that captured the attention of the entire Houston community. The case of Ryan Brooks and Jake Thompson, accused of the murder of Ellie Brooks, was a brutal example of family betrayal and deception. The courtroom was packed, and reporters were eager to catch every detail. From the outset, the prosecution presented its case as an obvious murder for self-serving purposes. Prosecutor Jennifer Collins, speaking confidently to the jury, detailed Ryan's motives. She emphasized the defendant's financial difficulties and his new affair with Hannah, who was present at the trial as a prosecution witness. The prosecutor reminded everyone of Ryan's recent purchase of insurance on Laura's life and showed documents proving the payment of a large sum of money in the event of her death. Ryan's defense, represented by experienced criminal defense attorney Michael Warren, attempted to create an alternative version of events. Warren argued that Ryan was shocked and depressed by his wife's death, and that the prosecution was based on speculation and on hasty conclusions of the investigation. He noted that Jake Thompson, who testified against Ryan, may have acted on his own motive and falsely accused him to mitigate his own punishment. The first witness for the prosecution was Laura's close friend Susan Miller, who described the difficulties in the relationship between Ryan and Laura. She described how, shortly before the tragedy, Laura had complained about her husband's coldness and aloofness. Susan also mentioned Ryan's threats and aggression, which had escalated in the final months of their marriage. Next to speak was Hannah, Ryan's new girlfriend. She admitted to their affair and talked about his promises to divorce Laura in order to be with her. Her testimony proved to be a powerful blow to the defense, as it confirmed Ryan's version of motive. The defense tried to discredit Hannah by pointing out her possible personal interest and that she may have exaggerated the importance of their relationship for her own gain. However, Hannah's testimony proved persuasive to the jury. The most important witness was Jake Thompson, who agreed to a deal with the prosecutor's office and pleaded guilty. He told about his participation in the murder and described in detail how the crime was planned. Jake explained that Ryan got the idea to eliminate Laura because of financial problems and a desire to start a new life with Hannah. He also mentioned that the insurance policy on Laura's life had been a key factor in their decision. Thompson stated that they planned the murder in advance, choosing their wedding anniversary to create the appearance of randomness. Defense attorney Michael Warren tried to refute Jake's testimony, saying he only confessed to mitigate his sentence. Warren argued that Jake could have acted on his own and Ryan had nothing to do with the murder. He also emphasized the lack of direct evidence linking Ryan to the murder and said all evidence was circumstantial and interpretive. However, investigator Carl Rivera presented strong evidence. Printouts of phone conversations between Ryan and Jake, messages discussing the murder plan, and the results of forensic tests. The next part of the trial focused on Ryan's financial difficulties. Moreover, the prosecuting attorney showed the court bank statements showing that Ryan had been trying to get a loan secured by insurance, indicating his desperate situation. The defense argued that financial problems were not a sufficient motive for murder and that Ryan loved his wife despite his difficulties. They presented witnesses from a close circle who spoke of Ryan and Laura's loving relationship, which they said was inconsistent with the prosecution's version of preparing the murder. In closing arguments, prosecutor Jennifer Collins reminded the jury of the sequence of evidence pointing to Ryan's guilt. She emphasized his motives, plans, and indifference after the murder. Collins presented Jake's testimony, which she said fit logically into the prosecution's case, and also highlighted the financial transactions that supported the preparations for the crime. Defense attorney Michael Warren insisted in his closing argument that the evidence was not conclusive and that Jake Thompson's testimony was unreliable. He asked the jury to consider that the prosecution had failed to provide direct evidence and that there were significant gaps in the prosecution's version of events. After much deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Ryan Brooks was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Jake Thompson received 20 years in prison as part of a plea deal with prosecutors. The story of Ryan and Laura Brooks shook Houston. The case epitomized family tragedy and betrayal. Ryan, who once seemed like the perfect husband, turned out to be a cold-blooded killer willing to do anything for money and a new life.